Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Let's begin. This is the last of our four-part series on outer shells, inner sparks, and divine potential. And it's been such a interesting, evocative, perplexing, beautiful exploration together. And I have found this to be a really beautiful engagement and conversation with Leah Gold, our visiting artist. She is leading a nature walk and practice of observation, and also gathering, collecting natural materials for the two different online workshops that she's offering this coming week. And it's been such a rich exploration to be delving in these Jewish sources, drawing these visual images. And then she's been giving us these arts prompts to get into ways of connecting the words with creativity and art making bringing us back to the Jewish teachings. The ways that she's been using her visual faculties and instruction to engage with the material in beautiful and generative ways. So did anybody do the exercise? Yes, Nancy, show us what you got. Hold on, let me spotlight you so we can all see you. Beautiful. Beautiful. Look at that, the sparks shooting outward. Last time we were looking at the human body and human souls coming into material form, possessing divine spark and being given these 100 keys of blessing as ways to remember our soul's origin on the tree of life. It's a pretty great text. From the Zohar. Nancy, I love the sort of container and bursting outside the container of those divine sparks. So today, we're gonna talk about evil. And it's before we look at the text, before we do anything source-wise, I want to sort of remind us and kind of look back at what we've been exploring. We've been rooted in the Kabbalah of Rabbi Isaac Luria from the 16th century, and his vision, insight into why anything at all exists and how it has come into being. With a foundation or an origin that has no origin of Ein Sof, divine limitlessness. If the divine is truly the divine, total and whole and unified, how is there a material world? How is it that there is division, that there is multiplicity, that there are dualities? How is it that anything exists at all? And what we experience is a physical world in which it's not obvious where the divine is. There isn't, it seems that divinity is masked in this life, in this world. And somebody asked right at the beginning of the class, asked a question about evil, about suffering. And I said, that's for the last class. But we moved through this mystical understanding of Ein Sof, divine, whole, unlimited unity being the everything, and desire arising within the divine. I have to say that in itself is utter mystery. How can that which is complete, whole, unchanging, suddenly have a sense of desire to be in relationship, a desire to create as a way to manifest God's compassion, God's mercy. And it's such a wild paradox that in order to be known, God hid God's self by creating a material reality where the divine is not in its full and radiant and allness form, because that form of the divine cannot coexist with the limits and boundaries of materiality. Does that make sense? It's worth repeating each class. And that divine oneness, desire, arose within Ein Sof, and God started to change God's self in order to move to this reality where there is physical universe. So what did Ein Sof do? Do folks remember? Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum, God contracted God's self from divine center point, also a mystery. What's the middle of the everything? But, human language is limited for explaining that which is utterly beyond language. So God contracted God's self to all sides, creating sort of a spherical chalal panui, empty space that was, as it were, devoid of God. And then, do we remember what happened? God refracted and emanated a sort of contracted divine light into that empty space in the form of the sphirot, these 10 divine emanations, so that that space doesn't just sort of explode and return back to divine oneness, but so that aspects of the divine can enter in a more contained form. So filling vessels, as it were, or sort of like the beginnings of materiality, on its way to materiality, contained divine light. But even that was too intense for the divine light to be contained, and shattered, exploded, big bang, a explosion of light and energy that resulted in physical universe and divine sparks being trapped in klipot, in these husks, these outer shells. That is everything that we see and encounter, that we experience, the whole of reality. Husks with divine sparks trapped within them, and this refracted, these elements of emanated divinity that we can sense into, feel into, witness in our own beings in the world. And what's our task in the world, according to this system? Did somebody want to say something? We are here to liberate the sparks. Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't it to repair?
Repair. This is the original, or a very particular framing of what tikkun olam means, which in our contemporary language, we talk about as repair of the world, as social justice. This is an elemental, much more foundational understanding of tikkun olam, that God had to break God's self to create a broken world, but still one in which divinity can be discovered and repair can happen, but only in relationship, only with us. So we, through our intentions, through mitzvot, through blessings, seek out those sparks, elevate them, and restore them back to divine wholeness, and make the world a place where divinity is ever more revealed. Pretty good task for Judaism, wouldn't you say? Quite a different framing from what any of us may have learned in Hebrew school or Judaism 101. We are part of a cosmic sacred task of making God whole again. And, luckily we'll never fully succeed, because the moment that it's truly a success, material reality would cease being, because God would be Ein Sof, totality again. Yeah? But we aim toward repair, reconnection, and revealing more and more of divinity. Linda, you had a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering how that relates to the 36 people that God would save the world for. Are they the beginning of this Kabbalistic thought?
So you're referring to the Lamed Vavnikim, the 36 righteous people.
Righteous people.
It's not that the world is saved for them, but they stand as the, were it not for them, embodying righteousness and engaging at a much higher level, more sophisticated and committed level than your average person. Were it not for them, the world would totally collapse into all husks, all evil. So that's one sort of school of thought that says that they are sort of the pillars. But in this framing, I want us to hold that actually we all have the capacity to liberate those sparks, to manifest the divine, and to engage in repair. Today, our focus on exploring evil and suffering. I want to look at a few different texts, some that are from the same era that we've been looking at, the Kabbalistic, 16th century Kabbalah, and others move into later Hasidut. The Hasidic movement developing as with some different interests and concerns, but placing a great deal of the spiritual process in individual human beings and in us as a community. Sort of deeper threads of psychological processes integrated with spiritual ones. So we'll get there in a moment. But I think the last thing that I want to say by way of introduction is that we've been looking at questions of how does anything exist at all? How do we find sparks of divinity in material reality? And now moving into the question of how do we understand evil and suffering in this system? There are questions here about how does this system, this framing, give us tools to relate to suffering in our own lives, as well as how do we create healing and repair in the world. So those questions can be answered in lots of different ways, but I'm really curious for us to think about and look at this dynamic of outer shells and inner sparks, and this system of how the universe came into being, how this might actually help us on the ground in our day-to-day life. Because if it's just this sort of wild theory, it might be interesting to contemplate and go, that's kind of cool, or it doesn't resonate with me. but it's here for us to actually live and apply and see how it can help us navigate. So let's join together in the bracha for this beautiful gift of Jewish learning together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Would somebody volunteer to read the first text? So in the first session, we read a lot from Chaim Vital. He was the primary student and disciple of Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari of the 16th century, whose ideas we're encountering. But Isaac Luria wrote almost nothing. As was the practice for many central teachers, he taught without notes, didn't write things down, but his students would later capture his teachings and write them down. So this is Chaim Vital sharing Lurianic Kabbalistic teachings. Lisa, thank you.
When the supernal emanator decided to create this material cosmos, it withdrew its presence in the manner described by our rabbis of blessed memory, when they said, he concentrated his presence between the two bars of the ark. For prior to this, the Ein Sof filled everything.
Okay, now, pause there. So just to note what he's doing, as has been the tradition since earliest rabbinic writings, anytime somebody wants to make a point, they quote from Torah, because the understanding is that everything is contained in Torah, and it is interpreted in layer upon layer upon layer. So in quoting, he concentrated his presence between the two bars of the ark, a verse from Torah. He's giving evidence to support his narrative of what the divine is doing what Ein Sof is doing in tzimtzum, in contraction, and emanating a universe. I just want to point that out because this will unfold in multiple places. And we're not going to spend time right now going into this particular verse, but there are other moments that it will be valuable to look at what the verse might be saying on its surface level, and how Vital or Luria or any of the Hasidic masters are putting on mystical goggles to read Torah through the lens of the life of the divine and divinity within reality, within material reality. So just holding the awareness that this is a pedagogic device, a way of saying, of course, Torah is not just telling a bunch of stories about a family going on a journey, this and that. Torah is revealing mysteries of existence, of divinity. Okay, continue, Lisa.
Now, it is known that even an inanimate stone is illumined by it. Otherwise, the stone could not exist at all. It would disintegrate. The illumination of Ein Sof clothes itself in garment upon garment. At the beginning of creation, when the Blessed One withdrew its presence all around in every direction, it left an empty space in the middle, surrounded on all sides by the light of Ein Sof, empty precisely at the centermost point. Had it not done so, the light would have been greater on one side than another, which was not the intention of the Blessed One, but rather he intended that the empty space would be surrounded equally.
Okay, pause here. I want to note a couple things. First, this is a lovely summary of what we've been reading in longer form. And the section begins when the supernal emanator decided to create this material cosmos. then we have this picture of tzimtzum, of God contracting God's self in all directions. Why do you think he would emphasize that it was not more light on one side than the other?
Like an image of balance.
Beautiful. Sense of balance, and that Ein Sof hasn't gone anywhere. All of reality is totally encircled by Ein Sof. We can't experience Ein Sof directly. We can hardly, we can't really grasp Ein Sof, but to know that all of the material cosmos is evenly engulfed in Ein Sof, that the universe sits in balance and gives me this image of a divine embrace. And we could say that if one side didn't have Ein Sof equally around it, perhaps there would be more distance from the divine at one place than another. One place is closer, one place more distant. But Ein Sof is equally surrounding all that is. I also want to note the example of even an inanimate stone is illumined by it. Why that example, do you think? Why not a tree or a human being?
Is it maybe because we can easily step on it, step over it. It doesn't have much. We think of a stone. It's just there, and yet, yeah, sort of it could be just thought of as nothing in it. It's so inanimate.
Mm-hmm. Something so ordinary. And I think it's important that it's inanimate. Perhaps it's easier to connect with a sense of the divine expressed in aliveness. So in a blade of grass, in a tree, in a bird, in a human. But to say that even an inanimate stone would cease to exist were it not for constant divine illumination. So all of reality needs this constant infusion of constant pouring down of divine presence, energy, light, for anything to continue to exist moment by moment. And Ein Sof, the illumination of Ein Sof, clothes itself. We've talked about this quite a lot, about these husks, these garments. I've been using the phrase, all of material reality is God in drag. There's something about that I think is so beautiful, that there's an external form that reveals it's contained in a way that and masked so that we can see it. But don't be confused that what you see on the outside, what you see on the mask, on the garment, is the whole truth of divine reality, of divine expression. But the garb is necessary. Okay, Lisa, would you continue? Here, hold on, let me just bring it there.
The light withdrew like water in a pond, displaced by a stone. When a stone is dropped in a pond, the water at that spot does not disappear, but it merges with the rest of the water. So the withdrawn light converged beyond, and in the middle remained a vacuum.
Quite an evocative image. So the sense that it may be hard to imagine, the imagery of God contracting God's self, to create an empty space. But this sense of the stone dropping into the water doesn't disappear. It gets displaced. I think that's an interesting, an important image for us to hold. And in that space, there is absence of water. All of the Hasidic texts and Kabbalistic texts use this phrase, kivyachol, as it were, whenever they're talking about God's absence. So God contracted from that space, created a space without God, devoid of God, as it were. And that beautiful little phrase that he's not using here, but comes up over and over again, kind of re-inscribes that we're talking about a mystery that is beyond what we can fathom, but we're going to keep talking about it. We're going to try to describe it through images, through metaphors, through human language, and at the same time with a little wink, don't be confused because it's impossible for there to be a space that doesn't have divinity. It's impossible for there to be anything, any dimension of time or space that is absent of divinity entirely. But so that we can get our minds around this set of images, let's use the metaphor of the stone in the water and the displaced water. Okay, would you continue, Lisa? Oops.
Then all the foulness and density of judgment within the light of Ein Sof, which had originally been like a mere drop in the ocean, became measured and was separated from Ein Sof, descending and gathering itself into the empty space. It became transformed into an amorphous mass, golem, out of the foulness and density of the power of judgment, as mentioned, surrounded in all directions, above and below, and on all sides by the light of Ein Sof. Out of this mass emanated the four worlds.
Okay, just to there for a moment. What is this picture? Out of the foulness and density of judgment, within the light of Ein Sof, foulness and density of deen, this quality of judgment, of discernment, but also like very sharp delineations, which had originally been just a mere drop in the ocean, now became sort of condensed and gathered itself into the empty space. And it became transformed into this amorphous mass out of the foulness and density of the power of judgment. I want to stay here for a while. I am going to put just that part of the text, let me see, there, in the chat. What do you make of this? This is not the Torah book of Genesis description of physical reality coming into being. There we have, and God spoke, let there be light, and whoa, there was light. And God said, let the lower waters be separated and create upper waters. And there was sky, and there were seas, and the land issued forth, and all the vegetation and order and unfolding, and at the word of the divine. And here we have foulness and density of judgment. What's your sense of what's going on here?
Feels like a plot twist, like
Mm.
like judgment, in Ein Sof, in like limitless just expanse. If it's, I mean, I know I'm coming in on class 4, but
Totally
it just
fine.
feels like there was no need for judgment within that existence. I don't even know what words to use, but within that construct, it's like judgment. Where did that come from?
So beautiful. So first of all, recognizing that limitless divine oneness, of course, I don't know, of course, contains all dimensions. So there is judgment that is part of that divine wholeness. But in the vastness of that limitless divine sea, it doesn't have quality of foulness, or it is totally integrated into this whole. But in that process of tzimtzum, the foulness and density of din becomes concentrated and removed or lessened significantly from that ocean of divinity, and becomes separated out. And that's what material reality is made from?
Couldn't they have picked a different quality? Like judgment and foulness? What about love? And, like, couldn't that have been the thing that formed us into four worlds?
Beautiful. So, according to earlier Zohar, the original, the central text of Kabbalah from the 13th century, and now moving into 16th century Kabbalah, continuing to build and riff on Zohar. That, remember, we were pointing to that desire arising in Ein Sof to create. That quality is rachamim, is expansive loving and mercy. So the desire to create, what is motivating and moving this whole process, is limitless love. But in order to create such a radically different context, a radically different reality, for relationship to come into being, it's in the form of din, of separation, of division. If we need to move from oneness to the dualities of relationship, that is such a process of fracturing and separating. And this text is saying, I'm so sorry, folks, but that's the nature of reality. In other words, we're not looking at it from the experience of the divine moving downward, but this is coming out of, what does human experience and physical reality look like? There is suffering. There is cruelty. There is pain. There is conflict and divisiveness. How can we explain that? We explain it by moving and imagining from this realm back into divinity. So if the world is as it is, we explain it by saying, or Chaim Vital and Isaac Luria explain it by saying, well, yeah, this world is filled with foulness and the density of all this separation of din, but don't despair, because there is divinity embedded and hidden through all of it, and Ein Sof surrounding all of it. And the emanations of what we're going to look at in a moment, the four worlds, which is a four-tiered way of framing the 10 sfirot, these divine emanated qualities of chesed, expansive loving kindness, and din, judgment and discernment, and tiferet, balance and beauty, and yesod, foundation. We'll look at the map in just a moment. But all of these different divine qualities that we experience in this world and can can heal and repair the more we bring them into expression. But that to go from limitless divinity to this world had to be a process that of such divine constriction and almost like a barfing out. They didn't write barfing anywhere in these sources, but that's just the images that come from me of this this mess that nonetheless is an expression of the divine, and that it's only in this form that there can be relationship. For us to exist, for us to be in relationship with God. And there's that paradox of God wanting to be in relationship, that profound, loving desire. And in order to do that, needing to be utterly masked and contained in this crap. Any further thoughts about that at the moment? We're going to be splashing in this foulness for the rest of the session, but any other thoughts at the moment?
Can you, the word golem, like we've heard this word in other contexts, can you just talk about what it means here or what it...
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about it. Here it's being used before the later understandings of golem as this sort of blob of earth and muck that then has life breathed into it. That I believe is 19th century. The sort of Jewish Frankenstein. But golem, like a mass of muck. So here it's that foulness and density that on its own is just dead matter. But infused with divinity, even that muck comes alive. Okay, so I want to look for a moment. So the section that where Lisa stopped, I know I'm not sharing the screen, but I'm going to share the map in a moment. So it says, out of this mass emanated the four worlds. Atzilut, which is the closest to Ein Sof, emanation. Bria, the dimension of creation or the realm of creation. Yetzirah, the realm of formation. And finally, Asiya, the realm of actualization or material physicality and doing. So here we have the 10 sfirot. So up here at the top, sort of opened, is the realm of Ein Sof. And then beginning to into the space of the Chalal Panui, the emptiness, God emanates and Ein Sof emanates and refracts these 10 divine containers, qualities, dynamics. And these upper three, Keter, Chochma, Bina, are in the realm of Atzilut. And it's within Chochma and Bina that this desire, the very beginnings of creating, emerge. And you see all of these lines. These are the dynamic flows of divine energy and light, ever moving. None of this is static. Then the next realm, Chesed, Gevura, Tiferet, is the realm of Bria, expansive, loving, Din, power of judgment and discernment, Tiferet, compassion. And Tiferet is also usually referred to the name of Kadosh Baruch Hu. The Holy Blessed One is connected with the realm of Tiferet. sense of king. Netzach, now moving down another layer. This is the realm of formation, coming closer and closer to the forming of material reality, with longevity, eternity, and hod, splendor, yesod, foundation. Yesod is often associated with the male masculinity within the divine, often connected with the phallus, and in relationship with Shekhinah in the realm of the physical, with the feminine. And so many of the Kabbalistic intentions before fulfilling a mitzvah seek to release the sparks that create erotic union between Shekhinah and Yesod, or between Shekhinah and Tiferet. So there's a lot of bringing opposites together, or bringing together different dimensions that have been refracted and separated from each other. So Kabbalah often uses gendered terminology to talk about creating unity and wholeness. And I think it's just important to note that they're operating within a certain gendered system and heteronormative system, but we can take these images of separated dimensions and the qualities and dynamic of restoring union and wholeness and balance.
I have a bit of a question. I'm not trying to be funny, but I see when you go looking at that chart, you see like a right leg, a right arm and a left arm, and a right leg and a left leg, and a phallus and a womb, but no head.
Keter, right at the top, Keter is crown. There are other, so this is also all mapped onto a sort of primordial, supernal human form. I didn't pull that one up, but you can look online and see this sort of like enormous God body that includes a head, sort of the whole structure of the human form, and that it is a map of our human form. So there is a head. It's not highlighted here, but it sits beneath Keter. So the crown is resting on a head. And that was a great question. You don't need, please ask any and all questions. This is kind of a wacky system, so please ask. So let's now go back to the text.
Where did this map come from? Like, how did it evolve? Did somebody doodle it? Was it a team? Like,
cool sketch. What do you think? Very much developed over time, and this is within the whole stream of Jewish mysticism. Mysticism is interested in exploring direct encounters with the divine. And so the mystics become very interested in, well, what is the divine? How do we encounter? Where do we encounter? What are the methods for connecting, for bridging the enormous gap between human life and existence and this not embodied oneness? And in their imaginings, it includes reflections taken from Genesis. If the book of Genesis says that God said, "Let us make humans in our image and after our likeness," there's lots of interpretation that has evolved from that of in what ways are we in the image of the divine. So the mystics have picked up, well, there must be something about our actual form. I think it begins in Sefer HaYetzirah, which predates the Zohar, where human form is starting to be imagined as God's form, And there are other references in Torah as well, where one of the prophets sort of sees God's body, kind of a shining light, and references to God's feet, references to the hands of God. So the metaphors that we encounter in Torah, or the anthropomorphisms, Torah seeing God with human qualities and human form, all of that gets picked up and developed further in mystical imaginings of, yeah, of course it makes sense that God is one enormous body, or that primordial man is Adam HaKadmon, is sort of the next level of God's physical being. And there's lots and lots of playing with that. That becomes less interesting to later mystics. Okay, we've had enough of like trying to describe how big is God's hand, and there's a whole text called Shiul Koma that's obsessed with how big different parts of God's body are. But then sort of later mystical teachings become much more interested in how we experience the divine. Does that answer your question? Sort of? Yeah, it's pretty wacky. I haven't done a thorough study of sort of how each stage kind of unfolds and where there's more concretization around physicality or the image of physicality, and where that shifts and changes and what gets dropped as we move along. But that would be very interesting to explore. I bet somebody's written about that. All right, let's jump back into the text. Lisa, would you read this last bit?
Yes. Okay. For in its simple desire to realize its intention, the emanator returned, sending into the mass a small ray of light withdrawn at the beginning, but not all of the light, because had it all returned, the original state of the cosmos would have been restored, but this was not his intention.
So into that mass, that golem of foulness and density of din, God sent, Ein Sof sent, this small ray of light. Because, as we've been saying, nothing can exist without divinity sustaining it, infusing it, enlivening it moment by moment. But the fullness of divine light and energy can't enter, because then it would return to all Ein Sof. So we have this refraction, this emanation, concentration of divine light. So that's setting our stage for the realities of evil and suffering. We have bits of God, threads of divinity in this mass. So I want us to look at a few different sources that explore and apply these ideas. And I want us to see what resonates and what doesn't. What might it be like to try on these ways of relating, experiencing, and thinking, and engaging? What might it do to our experience of suffering, or our relationship with evil in the world? So we're jumping now to the 18th century. This is a commentary on the Haggadah. And I wonder somebody else who might read.
I will.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
What we see here in Jacob's exile and later in the exile of the people of Israel to the land of Egypt is that it ultimately served a good purpose. It is necessary for the people to be in exile to redeem the divine sparks hidden among the nations. God is entirely good, but goodness is expressed through many different avenues. Also, nothing happens without God's decree.
Okay, let's pause there.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. I'm putting it in the chat. What do you hear in this?
I hear that, well, what stands out to me, nothing happens without God's decree. I hear that. And also there has to be adversity before good will triumph.
Mm.
There has to be adversity.
Uh-huh. It is a necessary state of this world. The underpinnings being, first of all, as you said, nothing happens without God's decree, and God's goodness is total. But don't be confused and think that what you find painful or difficult or unjust is the whole picture. Ultimately, this is all shaped by divine goodness. But here we are in a world that has been made out of this mass of deen, of judgment, of separation, of brokenness. And there are sparks in all of it. But what's this other piece about exile?
It's almost like you have to experience exile in order to really experience liberation.
Great. Not only in order to experience liberation, but in order to be participants in enabling liberation to happen. You humans and you Jews are here with a sacred, essential purpose of repair. The world is broken because it could not be otherwise. For there to be a world at all, it could not have been otherwise. But every experience of suffering, or here the specific examples of referring to Jacob's exile, leaving the land of Egypt, leaving the land of Israel and going down into Egypt, and the experience of the Israelite slavery for 400 years, that those experiences were essential in order to liberate the sparks that were there. Wholeness and healing and repair, liberation cannot happen if our attention is only on the places of niceness. Oh, I'll liberate the sparks in a sunset. Ooh, who wouldn't want that? We have to liberate the sparks that are in all of the brokenness. And so, according to this framing, God willfully, consciously, deliberately sent the Israelites into the place of suffering, slavery in Mitzrayim, the place of constriction, so that they would liberate the sparks that are embedded in those husks, those shells.
Just going to add that the image of exile, it's just like I'm looking for the words, but it feels like it's mirrors the ripples in the pond. Like if there's a center, if the land of Israel is the center and you're sent out, that it's another kind of, I don't know about contraction, but like moving away from the center.
Beautiful. And you could easily be confused and think, there's no God here. I am in exile, not just from my physical home, but I am in exile from connection with the divine. But don't be confused. Just because you feel utterly lonely and heartbroken, just because you are in pain, don't be confused and think, oh, well, there's no God here. I am separated, I am cut off. This is a total reframing and saying, of course, the divine is right there in the exile, embedded in the discomfort, the pain, the suffering. And it's right there that is our task to try to drop in and find the sparks. Yes, we're aiming to return home, but you can't leap over. You have to move through the exile to return to relationship with the divine that is revealed. That's a beautiful point. Let's read a little bit more.
Despite the misfortune that resulted from these events, we are commanded to bless God for the good as well as the evil in our lives, because what appears to us as misfortune ultimately serves a higher purpose that brings us closer to redemption. We must therefore give thanks for the exiles which we have suffered, just as we give thanks for the redemptions which have experienced. It is for this reason that we begin the seder by saying, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. We praise God for having made us slaves, just as we praise God who took us out of there. Similarly, this is the reason we eat bitter herbs at the seder, to give thanks for the bitterness of slavery, just as we give thanks for the freedom we gained. We also say, at first our ancestors were idolaters, to remind ourselves that the purpose of exile was to lift up the divine sparks which fell into the world through the sin of our ancestors.
And let's talk about this.
Yeah, I find that given all the suffering the Jews have experienced, I find it kind of hard to justify it in this way.
That's important for that voice to come. This sounds like too much. It sounds like, is it apologetics for suffering? That is really valuable and important discomfort and maybe aversion. I want to just point out something that's being referenced here. In the Mishnah, there's a statement, we must bless God for the ra, for the evil, as we bless for the good. And this is the origin of the blessing that we say when we hear terrible news or hear about a death. Baruch Dayan ha'emet, which can be translated as blessed is the judge of truth, or blessed is the true judge. That this is a place of saying something awful has happened. In this very moment, we connect to God. At the rabbinic level, the dynamic there is, I think, saying this is beyond human control. So I'm going to offer, I wouldn't say gratitude or thanks. I think that's quite specific here, and it's going to take us in a different direction. But the early rabbis were saying, in those places where there is pain, you also bless the divine beyond my understanding. So life and death are not in my hands, and I turn it over. This is playing with that Mishnah and actually saying it's more than just, okay, I recognize God's presence in good. I recognize God in moments that are painful. But actually, our text is saying this is an opportunity for gratitude. Thank you for the slavery, and thank you for the liberation. Thank you for the bitter herbs. I'm eating them not just to sort of try to embody, this is sort of what the suffering was like, or at least on a symbolic embodied level, but actually, thank you. Thank you for that suffering, because we were able to liberate sparks there. Let's hear other reactions.
Well, I've never seen a Haggadah that says, we begin by saying we praise God for having made us slaves. I've never seen a Haggadah that has that in there.
But it is quoting what we do say. The Haggadah says, Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt.
And not with gratitude, just we were slaves and God freed us with his right arm. And
so this is another interpretive moment, taking a ritual that is established in Judaism and putting on our mystical goggles and saying, okay, so we have this seder that begins, actually it has two different moments of beginning. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, a beginning of suffering, and jumping even earlier, our ancestors worshipped idols. And both of those have a trajectory, mignai l'shevach, from degradation to praise, from slavery to freedom, and from spiritual slavery, from idol worship to a recognition of relationship with the true divine. So that those trajectories that we tell in the Haggadah are now being completely reimagined. That actually they are saying those beginning experiences of degradation, of suffering, are there for us to touch into this very particular kind of gratitude, to bring a totally different orientation towards suffering. Other responses?
It's I struggle with it. These are moments where I struggle with sometimes, and even how we contemporize that. You should be grateful for what, just reframe it too quickly, and you want to kind of go, and maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but let me, say it's terrible, it's awful, it is awful, right? I mean, whatever that is. And I struggle with that. I struggle with that even contemporary, where people go, jump so quickly to, the good, the gratefulness in the terribleness. And I think we have to live in that. We have to be there.
Excellent. So this is not saying what you're pointing to in the contemporary moment. It's not saying, oh, I know your house burned down, but be grateful that you have your health, or somebody, saying COVID is so isolating and I haven't touched another human being in weeks and it feels dehumanizing. And somebody saying, well, at least you have a house and you're not, other people have it worse. No, that's not what this is saying. Be in the suffering. Don't leap over. You have nowhere else to be but in what you're experiencing. And with this lens, can I orient to see where are there sparks of divinity right here? Because if I'm already jumping to, well, at least there's this, or buck up, and, then I can't liberate those sparks. I have to be in the suffering, in the brokenness. And know there is no place devoid of God. There is no place devoid of that sacred energy, light, and that I can only access that, I can only know it by diving as deeply as I can and becoming intimate with its contours of difficulty, of pain. But that I know that that's not the whole story. And that is the world of difference. Other thoughts or reactions?
So that sounds like we're believing that the suffering is the husk, and we have to break through the husk to release the divine sparks of connecting with God.
Yes. This is the foulness, my dear ones. This is the reality that we're living in. As I want us to really hold this sense that it could not be otherwise. And that it is as it is because because Ein Sof wanted connection and relationship. And so God was willing to be broken into these sparks that are lost, that are hidden, that are under all of this muck, waiting for us to enter and access and break off the shell. Can that be helpful for you? Can that offer something for you in your own experiences? And we can hold that as a question. We're going to look at some other ways that these ideas are framed.
It just also resonates to me what you said earlier, and you can't go over, you can't go under, you have to go through, and it just resonates that.
Right.
Metaphor.
And we need good tools and practice to be able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just dive into the muck and expect to not just sink if you don't have the tools. It's easy to get lost in depression, in overwhelm, in injustice in this world. And so these practices are coming to say, here's how we're going to learn and develop the muscles to also see the sparks. And it takes practice. Can't expect it to come just from intending. But we begin with the ideas, with trying to get a wider picture in our minds, in our awareness. And then practice enacting, practice opening our eyes again and again. How is the divine here? How is the divine right here? Jacqueline, it looked like you were about to say something.
I actually wasn't, but
Okay.
I will say that I think it does, it is something to think about, maybe act on, but it's also, to me, sort of stuck in the center is the whole problem of evil, which, Jews have suffered disproportionately from. And it's just hard to deal with both of those things, I think, at the same time.
Yeah. And I think the questions of specifically why are we Jews suffering so deeply is at the heart of the attempt to give some kind of explanation or some way of not just dropping into we are other victims. There is actually we can take what is done to us, we can take the suffering that we have experienced, and there is, in this framing, there is sacred purpose to be drawn out of it. It doesn't say the evil is good, but it says that there is good embedded that can be lifted. And we can also say, I don't buy it. I can't dwell in that space. But I want to sort of encourage us to stretch and see what might it be like? How might it shift how we see suffering and evil? I want to be clear that this is not guidance for accepting it as it is. So this is not instruction to say, oh, people are oppressed all the time. That's just, divine sparks in evil husks. All you have to do is let the sparks out. We partly let the sparks out by correcting injustice. So it's not an orientation that just accepts brokenness as it is, but uses the brokenness for the sake of liberation on a human level, on a planetary level, and on the level of divinity. Yeah, Jacqueline.
I see. Yeah, I have a question. Yeah, I really hear you, and that's great. How to use the brokenness. On the other hand, what I find troubling is all this brokenness and oppression. Are we supposed to consider that is part of the divine plan?
Great question. I think this is so in that text that we just looked at, it's saying, yes, there cannot be anything that happens that isn't divine will, and no place is devoid of God. And this is one of those places where human reason smacks up against a wall of its limits. We cannot know or understand ultimate divine will. The choice could be to say, well, I reject that. I cannot be in a relationship with a God who creates any kind of evil and suffering in the world. Or we can say, this is where I am in utter, I'm confounded. I'm perplexed. But rather than diminish God's goodness, I face the limits of my understanding. And I will continue to do what is in my power to alleviate suffering and to correct injustices. And I think this whole framing is saying God's desire to be in relationship necessarily puts incredible power into human hands to be part of creating healing. So this sort of wild dynamic of the world could not be otherwise if God wants to be known, and God puts into human capacity the power to know God, to be in relationship with God. And in order to do that, we have the task of bringing repair and healing. And healing God, that's mind-blowing to me. God is also broken and suffering, as it were. And it's also, there's incredible potential for transformation in the human-divine partnership. That's quite astounding and mysterious. I want to look at one other piece of text to take this in a bit of a different direction, similar but direction, and see what you think of it. Hi, Leah. Good to have you here. Leah will be leading us in talking about the arts exercise in a few moments. So I want to look at a piece from the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, Poland, 17th century. So he says, sometimes a foreign thought is sent to a person, pushing them away from a spiritual ascent they are attempting. So by foreign thought, he means anything from, a thought of lust. He talks a lot about sexual thoughts that pull us away from moving toward connection with the divine. It could be jealousy, it could be anger, it could be hatred, it could be any thought that pulls us away from connection with the divine. Violent thoughts, all of this. But if you are wise, you can use that very thought to get closer to God. For even that thought is composed of letters, which are the limbs of the Shekhinah. Isn't that a beautiful phrase, a beautiful image? Composed of letters that are limbs of the Shekhinah, just that they have fallen among the husks due to the brokenness of the world. And the letters came together in an evil configuration. So first of all, why are we talking about letters? We have our system of sparks and klipot, husks. The letters, anybody want to guess? Genesis. What happens? How are letters used? And God spoke. God said, Vayehi or, let there be light, and there is light. All of creation is through divine letters. So here we have foreign thoughts of harm, of destruction, of evil, of distraction, of self-interest, whatever those foreign thoughts are that pull us away from intimacy with the divine and deeper connection with the divine. But even that foreign thought is composed of letters, composed of the very material of divine creation. They're just all jumbled up in the wrong order. Those letters have fallen. They're also in the klipot, in the husks, along with the sparks in the broken world. It is like a person who prepares different foods, each individually good, but then she serves them in combinations that make them repulsive. So it is with your thoughts. You've been cooking, and maybe, various thoughts and the material of the thoughts are delicious. But you mucked it all up by making the combination one that's of greed, or one that's of jealousy, or one that's of hatred. You must understand where the thought comes from. Lustful thoughts have fallen from a world of holy desire. Destructive fear has fallen from the world of positive fear or awe, yira'ah. Arrogance has fallen from the world of beauty. That's the Sfira Tiferet. So each of these are from the map of the Sfirot. That lust comes from chesed, comes from holy, expansive love and desire. Destructive fear has fallen from deen, from that quality of discernment, judgment, but it's taken on evil form. Arrogance from the world of tiferet, of sort of beauty, but it's beauty distorted. And so with all negative things which have fallen from their divine sources, you can connect these fallen thoughts to the Blessed One. When you connect them to the love and fear or awe of God, you are returning them to their roots. Interesting. So when I take my arrogance and I say, oh, wait a second, this is this sense of arrogance and what I'm claiming as mine and actually comes from a sacred place that is about harmony and beauty and balance, then I'm actually returning my thoughts and these letters to their aligned root. So it is with every negative thought. You must discern the divine attribute from which it has fallen, and then return the thought to that divine source. Then the husks fall off, and the letters recombine in positive ways. God takes great pleasure in this, like a king whose child is returned from captivity. Oh, isn't that amazing, that line? Certainly, this pleasure is greater than had the child never been taken. That as we realign the letters, as we release the sparks, as we do the mining to see what is harmful, evil, distorted in ourselves. So now we're not talking about what's out there in the world, but our own impulses that are hurtful and harmful and destructive. Those are also klipot. Those are also the husks and the messed up letters. But internally, we can also realign and return to the divine root, and that God delights in that, like a child coming home. Return from captivity. Oh, we are so captive in our small and harmful patterns. I see Lisa with your hand up and some comments that I haven't had a chance to look at yet.
Well, can you just describe the destructive fear from the positive fear? Can you articulate that a little?
Sure. So, yira'ah, a sense of awe in encountering divine presence. That holds trembling, but it is also expansive. And feeling your own precariousness, your own vulnerability, your finitude in the presence of the infinite. The small fear contracts. How do I save myself? How do I protect myself? What can I push away? What defenses can I bring in? Who can I shut out? That's the closing in of fear. And making it small and acting from a place that is contracted. That's where my understanding goes with it. Karen.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I was really captured by the image of the upside down, of the roots being in the divine sources. So I don't know if I'm understanding this right, but I got an image of an upside down tree, even though
Yes,
the image is of a tree of life. But then if the roots are in the divine, then if you think about roots, like I always think about roots in the ground from a tree. So that's an interesting image.
You are such a Kabbalist. That's exactly the image that we see in these mystical texts over and over, that those sfirot, those divine emanations, are the tree of life. And it is a tree with its roots in heaven. That's the language that's used. So its roots are where the source is. And the flow of shefa, of divine energy pouring down from Ein Sof through the tree, and Shekhinah, the indwelling divine presence, is the crown into this world. So you've tapped into it so beautifully. That's exactly the image. Other thoughts about the thoughts. And I would categorize thoughts as both thoughts and feelings. Sort of what gets jumbled and leads us to either actively be harmful or think and act in ways that hold us back from brave, loving, just connection and action in the world.
This is
I
not
find
in
pretty good.
response to what you just said, but
Yeah.
I liked the image of kind of breaking down the thoughts into letters. And it just connected to me. James has been doing this teaching about how experience is not solid. Like we think of an experience as total, but it's actually porous. And like, what if you saw your thought as a collection of letters that could be recombined? I don't know. I just like that image. That it's less solid.
Beautiful. So first of all, Evelyn's referring to Rabbi James Jacobson Maisels, beautiful teacher of Kabbalah and Hasidut and meditation practice. I really encourage folks to check out his teachings, and he offers a weekly meditation sit on Wednesday at 1. Is that right?
1:15.
What's that?
1:15.
1:15. James Jacobson Maisels, and his organization in Israel is called Or Halev. Please look it up. Beautiful teacher. And I think it's so helpful, the non-solidity of our experiences, of thoughts, of our feelings. And yet, how often do we clamp down and claim them? This is who I am. This is my identity. I am this kind of person, not that kind of person. Or kind of, well, I can't help it. This is just how I feel. Or this is just how I've taught to think and see things. So that's how I see them. This is actually teaching that we can work with our thoughts, our feelings, our experiences, with a little bit of spaciousness around them. We can work with them. And this is very much the framing of psychology and therapy, that thoughts and experiences and feelings that were formed in us in childhood have shaped us. But we don't have to keep living in that patterning. We can bring awareness and start to make different choices and create new patterns. So this is taking that and building it even further to say, this is a spiritual reality. And so the substance that we're working with is not only neurological pathways that have been deeply ingrained, but we get to play with the very stuff of creation, the letters that form thoughts. I find that really generative and freeing. I am more in my habitual patterning. The game in which we are playing is much is elemental. That's the word that comes to mind. Like the very building blocks of creation. Other thoughts?
I've been thinking about the journey from hopelessness to hope in terms of finding sparks somehow in the depths of no sparks, darkness.
What have you found so far?
There's some kind of trust that happens.
And hopefully this offers some additional tools. I wonder what for you, and I think the question of sort of what is the root of any of the foreign thoughts or feelings might be quite personal. So hopelessness, okay, it's right there, a place of deep suffering. One question to ask our teaching is, where is the divine right here in the hopelessness? In my breathing, in speaking out loud the word hopeless. There's also the question of what is the shape of the thought? Do I believe this will never change? That this is forever? Do I believe what is contained in the thought? And how can I play with the letters? That might sound like a strange thing to do in the place of pain. Play with letters? Or what is the process of moving? What's the root of hopelessness? It might be divine love. My distance from it makes it hard to connect with that sense of loving. Maybe it's the root is netzach, the eternal, the quality of longevity. And so something about having an experience that feels everlasting, but maybe within the tight place of hopelessness, actually there are other experiences around it that are the true longevity. Awareness. I'm aware of hopelessness, but I'm also aware of breathing. I'm also aware of awareness. I'm also aware of this moment of connection with Linda. I'm also, so this is such an interesting place of inquiry. And that in itself is challenging, because in the midst of hopelessness, how is there enough room to ask questions about it? Well, maybe I can ground myself in breathing or in connection, and that's enough spaciousness to be able to ask, is this everything that is? What else is available here? And just in asking, I think things begin to change. What a beautiful example. Thank you so much, Linda. And we learn to work with what is most difficult in this life, internally and externally. Beautiful. I want to turn to Leah. Would you take it? First of all, hello, Leah.
Hey, hi everyone.
For folks who haven't met Leah yet, this is a wonderful visiting artist, Leah Gold. Actually, would you say, before you give us this exercise, is there anything that you want to say about tomorrow's nature walk and observation and the 2 opportunities for workshops?
Okay, so we have 2 different events coming up that are linked. Tomorrow we're going to be meeting at the Brickworks. It's going to be sort of building on the same ideas as the small art prompts that I've been handing over to Rabbi Miriam, who's been sharing them each week during this learning series, which is taking these ideas of there being these divine sparks hidden in things and turning it kind of literal, kind of abstract, like just sort of grappling with this idea and using it as a jumping off point to do some tomorrow to go out into nature and kind of look for the potential for life, look for sparks of things that will be growing or have been growing in the previous season, and spending some sort of meditative time doing some close observation, as well as collecting things for use in an upcoming printmaking workshop. So it's two different standalone things. You can come to both, you can just do one, but we will be collecting things, looking at what we find, talking about the physicalness of it, the shapes and the lines, and sort of the beauty in the objects that we're observing. And using those things we collect on, I think, February. I don't have my calendar in front of me. We have two different dates. One is an adult workshop and one is a family workshop, and we'll be doing similar content. I think February 10th and 13th, is that right? Yeah, February 10th or 13th. And you'll get a kit to take home tomorrow, or I guess if you can't come tomorrow, another time this week that you can coordinate with the DJC to pick up this kit of art materials. And then we'll be doing a printmaking workshop online, investigating some of these ideas of hidden sparks, outer shells, hidden potential, and just playing with some art materials. Later on, I'm going to be collecting some of the elements that each person has made during that workshop and combining them to make one larger collaborative art piece. So that's something I'm going to be doing after the fact myself. Yeah, so
It's so exciting. And I just want to plug and encourage, one need not be an artist or whatever you think that means. This is accessible to everyone. And Leah was so beautifully guiding people in using materials and playing, and as a way to explore and a way to illustrate and express. So I really encourage you to participate. Leah, would you take us through our prompt for this week?
Sure. And just to sort of build on that last point, absolutely. The process that we're going to be doing, the techniques that we're using are actually the same for the children's workshops, which I'm going to be doing at the school, and for the adult workshops, meaning if you're someone who's really, really comfortable with drawing, with art making, you can make it as complex as you want. But in terms of the basic techniques we're doing, if you feel like your art making kind of stalled when you were, a little kid and you maybe lost confidence or weren't as comfortable making things, which is a really, really common experience, you'll be fine to come back into this as an entry point. So I really invite you to join me if you're not feeling like it's something you're super duper comfortable with. I will. So same thing for today's exercise. So for the first two exercises were sort of observational in nature when we were looking at the negative space around an object. And in the second week when we were drawing the fruits that we had chosen. Last week and this week, I wanted to make it a little bit more abstract and a little bit more of a sort of meditative or emotional exercise. So it's not about making a really complex drawing or about the drawing technique, but it's about an opportunity to sit and reflect on some of the ideas that Rabbi Miriam was talking about today, and just sort of bring your own experience into it. I think someone asked about fear, and that was actually, my microphone wasn't working to ask a question or make a comment, but that was something that I've been thinking about a lot. So I think I'm going to go back and sort of think about this idea of fear versus awe. And that's something that I feel like in this pandemic time has been sort of present for me, like what parts of fear come from a healthy respect and an understanding of our sort of mortality, I guess, and what kinds of fear kind of go beyond that and make things even harder than they have to be. Okay, and so it's the same materials as the last exercise, which is just pencil and paper and pencil crayons if you have them. So this week's art prompt is an encouragement or an invitation to reflect on a difficulty that you have in your life. This isn't meant to be super distressing. So if you want to go really deep and you have a really difficult thing that you want to reflect on, go ahead. If you want to just think about a minor annoyance like the loud music that your neighbor plays, you can do that as well. So whatever you want to take as an opportunity to reflect a little bit. And to visualize sort of a divine energy or these sparks that might be present in this darkness, whether that's an element of it that's positive or a way through it to sort of endure this or move through something difficult. And I was thinking about that last bit of text that Rabbi Miriam shared about the Baal Shem Tov writing, that negative thoughts are sort of like a jumble or a chaotic like rearrangement of something that actually could be divine or could be seen as a beautiful or positive thing. So the instructions, I will show you the slides, are the most important part of this is actually just to take some time to sit and reflect. So oh, sorry, I don't want to share, I want to. So to first sit down with your pencil and paper and just take a moment to visualize like an obstacle or something painful that's happening in your life. And I'm going to show 3 different examples of how I did this. And they were just sort of quick pencil drawings in my sketchbook. So the first way was to visualize it as an actual object. So this is number 1, visualizing a pain or difficulty as I drew it as sort of a spiky object, but imagining it as something physical, leaving some space in it to create these sparks. And we're using the same representation that we've been using, which is to create some colorful or vibrant patterning with your pencil crayons, and then filling that space with some color. So so imagining that there is some kind of kernel of something in there that might be hard for us to access, but that it's in there. The second way of visualizing that I imagined was to imagine an obstacle or difficulty as sort of a field of darkness that you can create a path through. So this one is more about it being concrete and fixed. The other is about movement and change, and very simple, making a dark space with a path that can move through it, and then filling that with patterning. And a pattern can be made by any repeating shape. So we're talking about sparks, I think bring to mind a very specific image, but any kind of repeated shape, colors of your choice. So that was the second way of visualizing. And then the third way of visualizing that I had was thinking about it as an obstacle to move over. So I was imagining myself on this hill and that there is something that's sort of buried inside it. And that was where the sparks were buried. So it's a pretty open invitation this week to try to it's sort of like simple and literal, but try to imagine and create the darkness in a certain shape and leave some space, and then play with actually it's like inviting those sparks to appear.
Thank you, Leah. I find these exercises so evocative, and encourage people to try to see what it yields. Evelyn.
I'm just wondering what's in the kit in case we already have this stuff at home and we don't need to coordinate.
Most of the things in the kit are super simple, but there are a couple things that you would need, which is a scratch foam. So it's a very soft piece of styrofoam that you can use to make a printing plate using a ballpoint pen. So it's a very, very approachable way to do printmaking, but yeah, it is kind of specific unless you happen to have it. Although you can use, like if you can't get away to get a kit, you can use the styrofoam bottoms of like a fruit. If you buy some like prepared melon or something and it's on a styrofoam tray, you can use that. It doesn't give you as much detail, but that's something you could use. And the other things are washable markers, like Crayola markers that in a dark color. There's some nice printmaking paper, so that's something that you would want to have. And the other things are like an instruction sheet and a sponge, like things you can kind of you can get the PDF or and you probably have a sponge or a cloth in your house.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah. Well, friends, let's make Kiddush together. And there were all kinds of other texts that I didn't include. And because, there's lots to talk about when it comes to suffering and difficulty. And one of the texts was a map of every mitzvah and every blessing being an opportunity to connect to letters in their right order. And so as we're about to turn to Kiddush, this feels like an interesting moment to kind of sit with what might feel misaligned right now. Where might there be a jumble of letters or tender difficulty or pain internally or in the world, and just holding the intention, even if you don't know what this means yet, holding the intention of our blessing Shabbat with Kiddush and Motzi, somehow being a way of bringing more alignment and balance. Let's see how that goes. Just to share a couple last thoughts, I'd like to I'm so grateful for this learning together, for the opportunity to read some pretty wild texts and really explore how they can guide us in our lives. I think that's what Judaism is here for, to guide, strengthen, reimagine, so that our best selves can come forward, so we can bring repair and healing wherever we go. And I'm so grateful to get to do this with you, to get to do this together. And to have the part of the art making resonates so beautifully. We are to be partners in creation. We can say that, yes, humans are partners with the divine in creation. There's so many ways that we can engage in creation. And I think, as you so beautifully said, many of us have been taught early on, you're not good at this, you can't do this. And it's such an important access, such an important practice in getting in touch with our generative capacities, our imagination, our playfulness. Those are essential tools, not only in making a physical piece of art, but I think that is an essential practice for living. To be able to be playful with our experiences, to be inquiring with our experiences, to find ways of imagining alternatives, to be fully with our experiences. What is this that I'm in? And so I want to give a deep thank you to Leah for engaging in this rich conversation that's going to continue with the workshops as well. Thank you so much, Leah.